we're just going to do a quick comparison here between the Mayday and the Thorne Buckingham kit. So we got the Mayday kit here on the right, and we've got the Thorne Buckingham kit on the left. So the TBRD01, this is the brand new one that's about to be in the store, and this is the one that's already in there. So this, up until this point, was the premier, like, high performance ClickRigs kit. It's got the unequal length center pivot A-arm front suspension. It's got a triangulated 4-link live axle rear. This little bit on here is just a little extra piece for a stop motion rig that can come off. And so this kit, let's go over some of the differences between the two kits. Actually, let's start with some of the similarities. So they're both A-arm front, long travel A-arm front ends. They're both triangulated 4-link rear suspension. So they're both pretty typical trophy truck setups. A butterfly leaf spring in the front, and they both use a quarter elliptic leaf spring on each trailing arm in the rear. But they're also quite a bit different. So let's start with, I guess, a couple of those differences. The A-arm setup is done in a different way. So on the Mayday kit, the upper A-arms are actually two separate pieces, and then the lower pair of A-arms and the uprights are one separate piece. And then those things come together, and then they attach here with this upright pin. So if I take them apart, you can see that's how the A-arm is a separate piece. And then this lower is a separate piece as well. And so there are some advantages to this setup. This upright, kind of being outboard and very tall, does a couple things for us. It makes it relatively robust and pretty strong. It adds a lot of stiffness. It spaces, these A-arms are spaced out 15 millimeters, like up and down. And so that provides a fairly rigid setup. It also means that we can bring the axle in kind of tangent to the bottom, so we don't have anything sticking below the axle diameter. So it gives it just a little bit more ground clearance. The disadvantages to this approach, though, are twofold. One, it means the actual length of the arms, so pivot to pivot, is actually a little bit shorter than it could be, because you've got the space of this upright sticking inboard that you'd have to make the whole truck wider and to get a longer arm. So for a given track width, the A-arms are shorter. And then the other disadvantage is, because these are separate pieces, you have to connect the upper to the lower somehow. And so at the top of this upright, we've got this link pin. It's effectively like a ball joint, and it's very similar to a typical ball joint. It's a weak point. And so what happens in a crash is this will become separated. And so when we set out to design the Thorne Buckingham rig, the TBRD01, as a competitor to this, that was one of the first things I wanted to improve upon, was the durability of this front end. And the way that I ended up doing that was by essentially making this entire piece one continuous piece, so that out here, this upright can be much closer to the bearing and to the wheel. In this case, it's also not quite as tall, so we get a little more camber change as it cycles through. But to do that, to get it that close into the wheel, which gives us a couple things. It gives us a longer A-arm for a given width. So this one is actually a little bit narrower than the Mayday rig, but it's also got longer A-arms, which is advantageous. But to do that, we can't have, this link pin takes up space, and so you can't really package it in there. And so the way around that was to actually just make the entire A-arm setup out of one piece. I'm going to kind of show you what that looks like. So fish it out of there. And so you can see this entire thing has been manufactured as one continuous piece. And so these pivots are just integrated there. So the whole thing gets connected at these 4 points at the top, but the entire linkage is one deal. And so that, again, gave us the advantage, allowed us to package a longer A-arm without having to go super wide. It makes this connection here a lot more durable. And yeah, it's, I think, overall a good setup. And then the other kind of differences here, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but on the Mayday kit, the lower A-arm assembly, the chassis spacer in the center section is molded into that lower arm as one assembly. Whereas on this one, this assembly is flat and we actually have a rigid main beam connector. And what that does is it just adds strength and makes this entire thing a lot more rigid. And the entire thing gets sort of sandwiched in there. Just pull this on these connectors, tie the whole front end together. And that kind of brings us to another difference in these front ends, or how the wheels attach. All of these connections for the wheels and bearings are pretty much just friction. This one is this 3/4 round, and it just presses on. And that does a pretty good job. But again, similar to the upright, in a big crash, sometimes these come apart. Again, not a big deal. It's not a permanent breakage. It just means you have to repair the crash damage by sticking the wheels back on. But I wanted those to be a little bit more robust, so you don't have to reattach your wheels quite as often as you're playing with these big way. It might be difficult to see, but essentially there's that little lip molded in. So we went to a hex shape and then a little retaining lip. And I don't know if I have a bearing here, but it takes a lot more work to get the bearing on. So now once the bearing's on, the bearing pretty much won't come off unless you decide to pull it off. But that's a much larger surface area friction connection, and so that's more durable. Once it pops through, that is very solidly retained unless you actually kind of push that lip in and work it off like that. So anyway, that's an improvement. These will pretty much stay attached. And then I guess moving on to the rear, we have a similar setup. On the new one, we've got so on the Mayday rig, and as on a lot of our other rigs, this used a wedge system, which might be a little hard to see here, but see if we can retain the wedge. So the rigid part of the axle has this little orange wedge, and this thing's tiny. And that kind of goes in this little V groove and just gives a little bit of like extra compression and elasticity to retain the bearing. But they can be a little tricky, and when they do come off, it's easier to lose the wedge. And to get it on, you kind of have to hold it and then get it started and then push the bearing on. And that worked. It's just not as nice as it could be. And so that was the other thing I wanted to improve. Actually, it's probably easier to see it on this one because there's more contrast. So the way we fixed that was on this rear axle. It's also rigid, but it has a hex that protrudes out. And then there are these elastic hexagonal top hats that press over it that also have the same lip that's in the front. And once these are on, you can get them off, but they're not really intended to come on and off all the time. They're designed to be retained. And so that snaps into place, and then you can snap a bearing onto it. And so overall, pretty happy with the way those improvements have worked out. And so now you've got a rig where all of the bearings are nicely retained, but you can still easily remove the axles. And these are just standard 608 skate bearings. So you can get all kinds of high performance bearings for these things if you really want to bust them loose here. Let's see, what else has changed? So again, you can see the Mayday kit is wider by a little bit, and I wanted to make the Thorne Buckingham rig just a little bit more compact to suit his driving style, while still being very high performance and long travel. So in some ways, the Thorne Buckingham kit is a little bit narrower, but also has more front wheel travel. And then on the rear, kind of the same thing. It's a little bit wider and shortened up. The overall length of the two rigs is the same. So like from here to here is the same, but the wheelbase on the TBRD01 is a little bit shorter. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, because I wanted to get a shorter trailing arm into the mix, just to make the suspension a little bit more controlled and a little bit more, the whole system a little bit more rigid. But also so that we could, instead of mounting the spare tire on top of the tail, like on the Mayday kit, I wanted to be able to mount it underneath to keep the center of gravity lower and still have the axle be able to tuck all the way up to the tail right in front of that spare, and shortened this length up a little bit. And you can compare the differences. You can see that this one's a fair bit longer. And then you look at the bottom, and it's also, you can see the differences quite apparently, because if you like match up the two pivot points, which are at the same spot compared to the cab, That's where they land. Advantages and disadvantages to both. This thing is, to me, it's an ungainly teenager that grew too fast and doesn't quite have total control over his limbs. This thing has a lot of travel, just a lot of motion, but it does have the ability to absorb some really gnarly bumps. It's not the most controlled rig, and when it gets out of hand, it just tumbles. So it's like a 90s era trophy truck when all the ideas were there, but they weren't totally refined yet. The wheel travel was large, but it wasn't necessarily the most controlled wheel travel in the world. When you watch videos of a current trophy truck versus trucks from that era, the trucks from that era look more impressive, even though they're not as fast, just because they're not nearly as controlled. It's always like they're riding that fine edge of chaos. And so that's what the Mayday rig is like. Even though the new one, the TBRD01, is a better rig, the Mayday one is just a ton of fun to watch going down the ramp or descended off jumps because it's just barely in control. Whereas the Thorne Buckingham one, tighter, more compact, more rigid, more when it goes through a course or down the ramp, more composed. Even though at the extreme ends, it probably doesn't have as much ability to absorb giant impacts, it does have a better ability to stay composed through them, if that makes sense. The other area, getting back to link pins, this one, these individual main links, and the kit without the upgrade, these are individual link pins as well. In a crash, these will tend to separate. And fixing it, it's just a matter of popping it back in. But one of the things I wanted to do with this rig is make it more tolerant of a crash. So there's just less repair that you have to do on it as the thing tumbles. And so part of that was integrating all of the highly loaded link pin mounts into more snap dot locations. And so to do that, there's a top and bottom axle truss, and that truss not only picks up all three snap dot points on the axle to retain the upper and lower links, but it also has these clips that basically snap over and then hold that whole thing together. So it's a very robust system. And then similar kind of inboard, there's been a lot of custom components or new components made primarily with the goal of retaining this upper triangle link and then these two lower struts. Let's see what else is different. The tail boom is actually quite a bit different as well. On the Mayday rig, this one is manufactured with the side flat, so you pretty much just have a flat surface to work on. And then it's unsupported, so this whole thing is cantilevered all the way out, and then it takes a lot of impact. It's got the weight of the spare tire hanging back. It's what stops the up travel. And so in order to keep the cab and the tail boom connected, we need these three massive 1x5 connectors. And those do a good job of that. It's just not the most elegant solution in the world. And so on this one, I've actually inverted the tail piece so that this is the flat side, canted the whole thing up a few degrees, I think 5 degrees, something like that, and then recessed a single 1x5 connector with this neat X-brace kind of retention cap. And then because it's still cantilevered just as far out, to get away with just the single connector, we support it by triangulating the whole thing with these struts, which are just essentially flexible links that pick up here and then come out and support this tail. So now this tail is triangulated through here, and it's much stronger than this one, even with just a single 1x5 connector. So it kind of looks cooler. From an engineering standpoint, it's a little bit more elegant of a design. The other big difference is in the design of the springs. And so with this one, we're introducing something that we're calling a recurve spring. And essentially, it's just a change in the way the springs are manufactured. They're manufactured flat in this direction, which means then once you preload it, it's bending it out from its natural state. Whereas with the recurve spring, we actually manufacture them in this direction, which lets us build in a certain amount of preload curve, which does a couple things. It helps you get the full droop travel out of the system, but also these springs, because they're made out of a polymer, will take a set over time. A steel spring will as well, it's just not quite as pronounced. And so the recurve spring essentially allows you to build some of that set, or to compensate for some of that set. And so you get a spring that doesn't just immediately or not immediately, but after an amount of time sitting on its own weight, doesn't droop, doesn't sag as much. That said, with all of these springs, they'll all take a set. It's just the nature of the material. So if you've got a rig that has a spring set, all you have to do is store these things on something that allows the gravity to pull the suspension down into the droop state. And after a day of sitting like that, these springs will be restored. And so that's why we do recommend you store them. You can either take the links out to take that load off the spring, or you can just store them on something. And so with this release, we're also going to be releasing a stand. This isn't the final color, but that's similar to the design. And then on this one, it's just designed the mesh in there. And so storing it kind of like that on the stand. And this obviously works with the wheels on as well. Although it does look cool with the wheels off. It's like in a prep state, like it would be in a race shop. By storing it on a stand, you make sure that those springs will never take a set that has to be undone. And so the recurve spring, and we did that on the rear springs and on the front butterfly spring. And so that basically just builds more integral tension into the springs at the right heights that we want. And so that has worked out really well. So moving forward, we're probably going to do all of this style of spring in the recurve format just because it works so much better. In a lot of ways, it's similar to the leaf springs, which obviously are manufactured with this curve built in. And depending on the rig, this is the Earl Motors Baja Race Commando. And so it's got a stiffer spring set. It's not really designed for articulation. It's meant for absorbing bumps and jumps compared to the Rock Boogie, which is a very similar setup. It's a solid axle leaf spring, but those leaf springs are much softer. I think they're a little longer as well, and they have less pre-curve in them. And those are not designed to jump, but they are designed for max articulation to keep wheels in contact with the ground as they articulate over obstacles. Just something to note. We've got these side covers here that just clean up the sides. You can see more of a cosmetic thing, but it makes it look cool. Those are all the layers, and then the side cover just kind of snaps over just like that to clean up the whole look. And yeah, those are some of the primary differences between these rigs. And so see them here, but they're both super fun rigs to have. If you can only get one, I guess the way to decide, this one again is a little bit more complex, has more finish work on it, and especially if you've got like a younger child who's playing with it, this one will hold up to the abuse of small children toward the toy a little bit better than this one will. But if you enjoy the fun of watching a barely controlled super long wheel travel thing plow through obstacles, this one is very entertaining to watch. Even if you're performing repairs on it by popping the pieces back together more often, and even though it's less refined, this one is a joy to watch because it's crazy. And so the real fun is having both of them and then being able to compare them down a similar run and see how these somewhat subtle changes, they're both the same sort of suspension plan. They're both the same overall layout, but how these subtle changes can make a pretty big difference in the dynamics of a vehicle.